In this makers table for half-year convention, we see 6 different recovery periods. So if an asset is a 5-year class life asset, we're going to use this column every single year of that asset's life. So in the first year, we're going to take 20% of the cost of that asset as depreciation. The second year, we'll take 32%. In the third year, we'll take 19.2, etc., all the way to the end. Note that the 20%, or this table actually, this entire table uses double declining balance to depreciate. Double means double the straight line rate. And yet, at first glance, it looks like this is not double. This looks like straight line, because straight line is always 100% divided by the life. 100% divided by 5 is 20. That's the straight line rate, not the double declining rate. However, we take the straight line of 20 and we double it, and this would be 40% except for this. A half-year convention says even though it's 40% for the first year, we're only allowing half of that full amount in the first year. So it's built into the table. The reduction by half year is built into the table for the first year. It's also built into the table for the final year. Everything else in between is the full amount. So let's take a look at a 5-year asset in year 2. So in year 1, we deducted 20% of 100. That leaves 80%. 80% divided by 5 is 16%, and that's the straight line rate of depreciation. We're able to double that to 32. So in the second year, we take 32% of the asset's original cost. We do not have to take another half year of that because it's not the year of acquisition. So the tables do build in half of the full year's rate in the first year and in its final year. Now, what happens is if we dispose of an asset before the 5-year life, let's say we dispose of it in year 3, this 19.2 is a full year depreciation, and the rule for half year says we have to take half a year's rate in the year that we dispose of it. So we would have to know as a tax preparer to take 1/2 of the 19.2 and multiply that by the initial basis to get the depreciation. One more thing to note is that 5-year assets actually take longer than 5 years to fully depreciate according to this table. And we might ask, why is this so? Well, if only half a year was taken in the first year, then there's going to be some left over, some of the basis left over after 5 years to depreciate, and that pours over into the 6th year. So each of these 6 categories or class lives, 3, 5, 7, 10, 15, and 20, take 1 extra tax period to fully depreciate because of that half-year limitation, half-year convention. And it may not look like that for the 10, 15, and year 20 property, but that's because this table is going to be continued on the next slide, and we'll see that the 10-year property gets fully depreciated by the end of year 11. The 15-year is depreciated in year 16, and the 20-year is depreciated in year 21. Those are shown right here. So we always have to look at the percentage. These are all percentages, so we would take that percentage for a 15-year property in year 14. But if we sold it in year 15, first of all, if we sold it in year 16, we would use 2.95 because a half year is already built in there. But if we dispose of it in year 15, this represents a full year's depreciation, 5.91. We'd only be able to take half of that in the year we disposed of it. If a company is subject to the mid-quarter convention, they use a totally different table than the half year. They use the mid-quarter table, and this is just showing the percentages for 5-year and 7-year property, and there would be all the other years included in a table as well. So what happens is once a company is subject to mid-quarter because they placed more than 40% of that year's acquisition of assets in the last quarter, all assets placed in service, regardless of when, regardless of which quarter, have to use this table. So remember that 5-year property in the first year, half-year convention was 20%, which was 40% times half a year. If the asset was placed in service and subject in the fourth quarter and subject to the mid-quarter, only 5% can be deducted, which is significantly lower. And that's what Congress wanted to do, is make sure that somebody didn't save all their money till the end of the year and then buy a large amount of assets only to take a large depreciation deduction. But for some taxpayers, it actually works to their advantage if they're subject to mid-quarter and they did place assets in service in the first quarter, because they get more than 20%. So it depends on when in the year the assets were placed into service. For the year of disposition for assets subject to mid-quarter, we look at this table and we see that we would take whatever's in the table for the quarter that the asset was disposed of, first, second, third, or fourth, and then take only this percentage of the full year depreciation. And the reason is this: the mid-quarter convention says not only when you buy it and place it in service, but in the year that you dispose of it, we treat it as if it was disposed in the middle of the quarter in which it actually was disposed of. So for example, if an asset was disposed of on May 27th, that's in the second quarter of a calendar year. May 27 is one of the 3 months in the second quarter: April, May, and June. But instead of treating it as actually being sold on its actual disposition date of May 27, it's treated as being disposed of in the middle of that second quarter, which would be May 15. So it then is deemed to have been owned until then, which was January, February, March, April, and the first half of May. And that's 4.5 months. So any asset subject to mid-quarter convention disposed of in the second quarter is deemed by Congress to have been owned for 4.5 months of the 12-month annual period. When you divide 4.5 times 12, you get 37.5%. So rather than being able to take a full year's depreciation, you can only take 37.5% of that full year's depreciation. And so, again, it doesn't matter. Let me use one more example. Let's say we dispose of an asset on July 2nd. July is in the third quarter, July, August, September. Mid-quarter says it doesn't matter if it was sold on July 2nd. Let's treat it as if it was sold in the middle of that third quarter, which would be the middle of August. Therefore, the company would have been deemed to own it all the way through the end of July, which is 7 months, plus half of August, which is 7.5. So that's where this 7.5 comes from, divided by 12, gives you 62.5%. So the company can deduct 62.5% of a full year's depreciation for that particular year. And that's the mid-quarter convention percentage in the year the asset's disposed of. Here's an example of a company that buys 2 assets, a machine and a computer, and the cost is given as well as the date those assets were placed in service. We also need to know which quarter that is. So February is in the first quarter of the year, October is in the fourth. Whenever assets are placed to service in the fourth, we always have to check immediately to see if more than 40% of the assets purchased that year and placed in service were placed in service in the fourth quarter. If so, they're subject to mid-quarter convention. If not, we can use half-year convention. 1,200 of the total, which is 47, is 25.53%. It's far less than 40%. We don't have to worry about mid-quarter. The company will use half-year. Now let's switch it around and say they bought the more expensive asset in the fourth quarter. Now 3,500 of 47 is over 74%, which exceeds 40%. So now the company has to use mid-quarter. And note, they don't use mid-quarter only for the 3,500 placed in service in the fourth quarter, they have to use mid-quarter for all the assets, in this case, both assets that were purchased in that same year and placed in service. So instead of using the half-year convention depreciation tables, they have to use the mid-quarter tables, and it's going to give them significantly less depreciation for this machine. Instead of 20%, it only, or actually this is 7-year property, so instead of using the 14.29, which is the first year rate for 7-year property, they can only use 3.57. So it really does make a difference when the company places the assets in service as to whether they use half year or mid-quarter. And keep in mind again that companies can skirt this, they can avoid this by, even though they're subject to mid-quarter, they can still deduct a large amount of depreciation by using Section 179 or bonus depreciation, which we'll discuss later. For real property, we use another convention called mid-month. So instead of in the middle of the year, like half year, or the middle of a quarter, like the mid-quarter convention, this assumes that real estate was placed in service in the middle of the month in which it actually was placed in service. And we also depreciate real property using straight line, not double declining balance. There are 3 recovery periods for real estate or real property, either 27.5 years, 39, or 31.5 if the property is residential real estate, meaning a dwelling place like an apartment or condominium, then it's 27.5 years. If it's non-residential, like an office or a warehouse or retail store, it depends whether it was placed in service before or after May 13th of 1993, which is when a tax law came into effect. The life will either be 39 years or 31.5. So we would take the cost of that real estate, excluding land, because land's not depreciated, and we would take that cost divided by 27.5 or 39 or 31.5 years, but we take part of the year in the year of acquisition and in the year of disposal. So the example here is the company bought a warehouse and the land for $170. Only the building portion, which is $120, can be depreciated. The land is not. So we take $120,000 and we look in the mid-month convention table for this asset. And it was placed in service in the 7th month, so we're going to look in the 7-month column, and it's just a little over 1%. So look at this. An asset that costs $120,000 can only be depreciated $1,412 in the first year. It's going to take a long time to depreciate that, and we can see that because the lives are so long. That's the end of 3.